Good afternoon from Manila and warm greetings to those joining from South Asia and Central and West Asia region. Thank you for joining and welcome to the regional consultation on ADB's different financing modalities. This is the 20th and the last set of regional consultations during the phase 2 of the safeguard policy and review update process at Asian Development Bank. My name is Gelson Garcia, your overall moderator. This consultation is with the civil society organizations in South Asia and Central and West Asia. 106 stakeholders from 18 countries registered in this last session. I understand this is the 84th regional consultation session since we began in November of 2021. Now, 70 are from non-ADB network. So I'd like to specially mention those countries represented here, including Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan from South Asia. And then we have Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan from Central and West Asia. And we're also joined by other representatives from other Asian countries. Since the start of phase 2 consultations in November of 2021, ADB has embarked on extensive consultation in a face-to-face, online, and blended formats. The stakeholder engagement approach has been comprehensive, inclusive, and diverse, which was marked by 20 thematic regional consultations based on analytical studies, 10 in-country consultations across regional operations of the bank, 8 field consultations with the project affected and vulnerable people encompassing government and private sector projects across different sectors, focus group discussions with ADB's private sector clients, and additional meetings with the indigenous peoples leader from the Asia region and members of the Sogiesk community. With your participation today, you are adding to more than 3,360 stakeholders that we have engaged thus far. The summary notes that we're consolidating to really provide the depth and breadth of comments and recommendations that would definitely feed into the drafting of the new policy. So again, thank you for keeping your engagement. A very important topic in the safeguard review process, we will discuss the lessons learned from the challenges and good practices in the application of safeguard requirements for different types of financing modalities supported by ADB and partners. We will also discuss the proposed issues for consideration in ADB's revised safeguards policy that deal with the sovereign or government and private sector lending and other financial services. A huge part of this consultation is an interactive discussion. In fact, we have 2 Q&A moderated sessions in this consultation. So before I call on our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. Please join from a quiet, distraction-free area. Turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. Be respectful to everyone, and we will manage time to keep with our schedule. IT support is provided, so you may ask support by typing on the chat box. As you're joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance when using important buttons. Simultaneous interpretation is available. Hindi, Urdu, and Russian interpretations are available in this consultation. We also ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Next slide. On the right hand of your screen, look for your name. Click on the More button on the right side of your name. Click on the Rename button. Type in your name and agency, then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or feedback, click the chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the smile icon or reaction button, then click on raise hand. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon. And to show your video, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from a wide range of stakeholders. So let me restate the safeguards that ADB has put in place to enable meaningful consultations. The consultations are phased to provide opportunities for you, stakeholders, to express your views and opinions on the environmental and social safeguards in the most meaningful and safest manner possible. We encourage you to express your inputs and concerns during this session. By joining these sessions, you are consenting to the video and audio recording of these consultations and their subsequent release. We will then prepare consultation summaries and disclose them publicly. This will ensure the accuracy and transparency of proceedings. If you wish to exclude yourself from such recordings, you may contact the safeguardsupdate at adb.org. That's the email of the Secretariat within 2 weeks of this session to share your exceptions and exclusions. The recordings and documentations allow the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. Background materials on the thematic areas have been released in preparation for the consultation and dialogues. All types of feedback are welcome. This will not be used for the purposes of retaliation, abuse, or any kind of discrimination. If you have any issues or concerns on the disclosure, recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any kind of discrimination during the consultations, or wish to exclude yourself, please contact us at safeguardsupdate@adb.org. We have 2.5 hours for this consultation. So here's how we are structuring the consultation time. We'll begin with Director Bruce Dunn, the Director of Safeguards Division of ADB Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, or SDCC, with his welcome remarks, an overview of Safeguards policy review and update, and where we are in terms of the policy directions and what's next. Ms. Zara Abbas will then follow. Ms. Zara Abbas is the Principal Environment Specialist of SDCC, and she will provide us an overview and findings on the analytical study on safeguards in different financing modalities. Now, just so everyone will follow the terminologies and acronyms used here, we will spell out those acronyms in chat a little later. And then after Ms. Zara's presentation, we will have the first moderated Q&A that will run for 35 minutes, which will be moderated by Duncan Lang. He's the Senior Environment Specialist of SDCC, and we'll have a 5-minute break. We will return with the second presentation. This time, it will come from Mr. Felix Oku, the Senior Social Development Specialist, with attention to financing modalities in private sector operations. Then we'll up to the second round of moderated Q&A, this time, again, moderated by Mr. Lang. We will have a quick event evaluation to get your feedback on the process and additional information to improve the way we run consultations. And then we'll have a wrap up by Mr. Bruce Dunn. On that note, we will begin the first session. May I call on Director Bruce? Bruce, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gelson. So good day, everyone, wherever you're joining from. It's really a great pleasure to be here. It's quite a remarkable occasion, actually, today. As Gelson has mentioned, this is the last of the thematic topics, the thematic consultations that we're undertaking here as part of this policy update process. 20 different topics, and for those 20 topics, there's been 84 separate consultation events involving our developing member countries and civil society. So it's been quite a process and quite a learning journey for us. We set out to have a very broad-based consultation program with civil society and many other groups, and really have had remarkable comments and suggestions from many people in the international community. And I do have to thank you for being part of that process. In fact, looking at the participants list today, I see, quite a number of people that have joined previous sessions, and that, is really something we owe you a debt of thanks for. Now, what I'd like to do in this opening remarks is just to give you a little bit of background in terms of what the topic is that we're covering today, why that's important, and I'll also give you an update on the process and what we're doing so far. Moving beyond the consultations in this stage, what are we going to be doing next? So, firstly, let's just start with the process. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see here a slide which covers the approach and methodology. And some of you that have joined previous consultations will have seen this, but we do have some updates also in the time schedule. So let me run through this briefly. We started back in 2020. There was an independent evaluation of ADB's existing safeguard policy statement. That's the policy from 2009. The evaluation recommended that we update and modernize the policy, and that we needed to address a range of gaps and emerging issues in the policy framework. After the evaluation was completed, we then launched the update process. We had an approach paper, we prepared a stakeholder engagement plan, and then we launched into this whole series of analytical studies and consultations. We've been working through that, and in addition to these thematic studies, we've also had country consultations and outreach to project affected people. What we're now doing, though, is starting to bring that together. And we in the ADB team are preparing the first draft of the new environmental and social policy for the ADB. We're working on a set of environmental and social standards. And also, and this is the topic of consultation today, we're looking at how we adapt the safeguards for the broad range of different financing modalities that the ADB has. We are aiming at this stage to have the first draft of the policy available for wider public dissemination and consultation. Our timetable for that is to make that available by the end of April or the beginning of May. We will then go and have some discussions with the ADB board in July on a working paper. That's a draft paper. And then throughout the rest of this year, we will then have further consultations on the actual draft. So at that stage, you will have received a copy of the draft. Stakeholders that have been involved in this process, we will be sharing it with you directly by email, but it will also be available on our website. You will have opportunities to provide written comments, but also in the second half of this year, we will have some further consultations. Some will be online, but we'll also be planning some events across the Asia-Pacific region. That will then take us through into next year. And then by the first quarter of next year, we will then be looking to take a final paper to our board. So we're targeting March for that. So that's the process that's aiming to take us through to have a new policy. But then after that, we need to roll the policy out. And we have a number of questions that people frequently ask about this, so I'll mention it here. One question is, when will the policy become effective? And will it apply to existing projects? So to the first one, we expect the new policy to become effective 1 year after it's approved. So if the policy is approved at the beginning of 2024, the policy would then become effective at the beginning of 2025, and we would apply it to projects that are coming through for approval at the concept stage. It will not apply to existing projects. The reason for that is that those projects have been prepared under the existing policy, and there are legal agreements in place with our developing member countries or private sector clients. So it'll apply only going forward to the new projects after the effective date. The reason for that also is that we need to prepare. And so after we've got the policy approval, we'll be doing more work on preparing guidance notes. All of the policy standards will have their own individual guidance notes. Plus, we'll also need to prepare guidance for the different financing modalities that we will have. And we'll need to prepare also the internal arrangements, institutional arrangements for that. Plus, we have to build a lot of capacity in our own staff and with our developing member countries. And we're looking at a phased program. We will be doing a lot of intensive work during the rollout period, but we will also be developing a longer term capacity building plan to support the process. So that's the overview of the policy update and the implementation. If I go to the next slide, you'll see here the long list of analytical studies that we've completed. I won't go through this, but all of these studies are available on our website. And we also have the consultation materials, presentations, and recordings of those, as well as the summaries from the consultations, which we've been making available as we complete those summaries. And if you look down that long list, we're here on the safeguards for different financing modalities. Now, if we go to the next slide, you'll see here, this is the proposed policy architecture model for the new environmental and social policy. And I'll try to just briefly summarize this for you. The new policy structure will start with a vision statement. This will articulate how ADB's new policy will support global agendas, such as the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, among others. And it will also articulate how ADB's long-term strategy, what we call our Strategy 2030, how the safeguards will support that. So that's a strategic and aspirational agenda. Then at the second level, you'll see policies and standards. We will have an environmental and social policy that will set out the overall policy objectives, and it will also cover ADB's roles and responsibilities. So these are our responsibilities for undertaking capacity building, for due diligence, for supporting our clients to understand and implement the policy. Then we will have a set of environmental and social standards. This will cover a broad range of issues. There will be requirements for environmental and social assessment, and then there'll be a series of standards which will cover different thematic topics, such as labor and working conditions, pollution prevention, we've got health and safety, land acquisition, biodiversity, indigenous peoples, cultural heritage, and then stakeholder engagement, and then a last standard that we're developing on climate change. So there will be 10 environmental and social standards. This will set out the mandatory requirements for our borrowers and clients. And then linking the environmental and social policy with the standards, you'll see on this slide a red rectangle. And this will be requirements for different financing modalities. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Up until this point, in a lot of the consultations, we've focused on more the thematic topics. Today, we're going to be focusing on financing modalities. And there are quite a few different modalities that the ADB supports. And this is very important because as the region in Asia Pacific has been growing and changing and developing, the demand for different types of services from the ADB is also changing. We still have demand for project and infrastructure financing, but there are also different needs. And we have a range of products to try and support that. We have things like policy-based lending, results-based lending. We also work with financial intermediaries. And we have a range of different programmatic approaches, things like sector lending and multi-tranche financing facilities. There's a whole range. And what we'll be seeking to do today in this consultation is to give you an overview of those. We'll be breaking it up into two blocks. In the first part, we'll be talking about some of the modalities that we typically use with our sovereign lending, that is lending out to countries, to our developing member countries. And then in the second half, we'll be talking more about financial intermediaries and corporate financing. Corporate finance in particular is used in the private sector. So through this, we'll introduce you to some of those modalities. We'll talk about how we currently manage safeguards for those and some of the ideas that we've got for adapting the safeguards further to enhance the way we deliver safeguards for those different modalities. So there's quite a lot to discuss, and we're looking forward to hearing your views as part of this. So I'll finish there, and I'll pass over to my colleague. I'll pass back to Gelson first, and we'll have some further presentation. So thank you again for joining, and looking forward to discussing with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. So now I will call on Ms. Zara Abbas, the Principal Environment Specialist, to provide us a background for our discussion today, which is the overview and findings of the analytical study on safeguards in different financing modalities. I believe that she will have a focus on the sovereign or government-supported financing modalities. And just before I call her, actually, I just wanted to note again that we will be spelling out those acronyms and other terminologies that will be used all throughout the discussion so that everyone hopefully will be on the same page. So over to you, Zara.
Okay, thank you, Gelson, and thank you, Bruce. As Gelson said, I'll be talking about the modalities which are normally and mostly used by our sovereign sector clients. Can I have the next slide, please? So, and we undertook an analytical study, which was a desk review of the different financing modalities that ADB has for its borrowers. And in addition to that, we also looked at any internal evaluation department studies. ADB has an internal evaluation department, and the evaluation department from time to time reviews some of the way ADB operates. So there are some studies of the different financing modalities. And then we also looked at our own implementation experience. And together with these, we have been able to draw some conclusions, and we've learned some lessons that we think we should be incorporating in our new policy when we look at how to incorporate safeguards implementation across the different modalities. Next slide, please. So in addition to the project loan, which is most frequently used, ADB has a number of other financing modalities or financial instruments to assist its borrowers and developing member countries. And these include program loans, sector loans, the multi-tranche financing facility, emergency assistance loans, and also other loans which are used by the private sector, such as financial intermediary support and general corporate finance support. So at the present time, under the current ADB's safeguards policy, we have a section which is called Safeguard Requirements 4, which explains how to use these, how to incorporate safeguards across the different modalities. Next slide, please. So here is on this slide, I'm going to talk about the sector loan. And on the subsequent slides, I'll be talking about the other modalities, and we'll have a similar format where there's a description given of that modality. And under the current SPS, what are the current safeguards requirements are listed on the left-hand corner, the bottom corner. And on the right-hand side, we will have the issues that we want to incorporate, which are issues for consideration for the new policy. So each slide will have the same format. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll just run through the description and focus more on the issues for consideration. So the sector loan or the sector financing is used or is applicable when ADB is going to support the development of a sector through financing sub-projects in a sector. So that could be, which could be, say, the transport sector or energy sector or water sector. And in this case, a large number of sub-projects are likely, but the number of projects are not known and at the time of the preparation of the project. And so what we do in such a case is that the safeguards requirements are that one or two sample sub-projects are selected, and the safeguards documentation is prepared for those sample sub-projects. And then a framework is prepared, which is used to identify what needs to be done for the subsequent projects which will come later. So that is what the present or current procedure is. So what we saw through the study is that there's certain things that we can incorporate in a new policy. And so what we see is that due to the nature of the sector loan, where we have a long-term engagement over multiple sub-projects, and the implementing agency we're likely to stay in touch with the implementing agency for a long period of time. And there is also it's one sector that's being considered. So what we see is that there's an opportunity to use this modality also. So what we currently in the new policy, we're planning to adopt risk-based classification, which means that we're going to see what is the overall risk, and that risk would determine whether the project, what type of project, what is the, across the entire project, the risk will be assessed. So that risk classification can give us an idea of what would be the broader safeguards implications over the entire sector for the period of the sector loan. And that can then be used to identify what type of safeguards documentation needs to be prepared. So rather than preparing a sector framework, one possibility is that if the sector is over the loan is over a large geographic area, then maybe a strategic assessment would be needed, or maybe a sector assessment would be needed, or possibly a cumulative assessment would be. So the type of tool that can be used would depend on the risk of the risk assessment. So that could be one thing to be incorporated, and also that the long-term involvement or engagement with a certain client or a borrower will give time to address the capacity issues of that borrower or of that agency. So these are some of the findings for the sector loan. And next slide, please. Similarly, the multi-tranche financing facility is also a long-term loan, and it's not strictly for one sector. It can be multi-sector, but it's the projects are known at the beginning, and the duration of the MFF or multi-tranche financing facility is 10 years. And what we see is that there is in this modality, the different tranches are so processed one by one, and the safeguards are prepared separately for each tranche. So that is the modality itself. Now, the safeguards requirements that we see can be modified under the new policy are that since again we know that the commitment is long, and there is an opportunity to identify what risks are likely for such a long-term project and for long-term involvement. So the risk assessment can again be used to identify the correct safeguards instrument to be used, the correct tool to undertake the safeguards assessment. So that is one thing that we can see. And another thing is that we see that due to the long-term engagement and the long-term involvement, it gives the MFF allows the time and flexibility to resolve long-term or any complex social or environmental issues that need longer to address. And then we also see that due to this long-term engagement, there's an opportunity to build capacity of based on that type of project, and the types of projects that are going to result. The capacity building can also be targeted to that. Next slide, please. One modality that is used to provide support to borrowers is the PBL, the policy-based lending, which is a form of a budget support, or it is a sovereign guarantee that supports policy reforms or development expenditure programs for a DMC, for a developing member country. And it can also be used to provide balance of payment assistance or counter-cyclical fiscal support. So some of the issues that can be considered in the new policy is, now a little bit of a background of a policy loan is that a policy matrix is prepared and it's agreed with the borrower or a government that these are certain policy areas where the government needs support. And ADB, the way it is implemented is that the borrower or the government commits to implementing a policy, and a policy is already designed. Once the policy is designed and implemented, that's when the tranche of money is released to that borrower. So what we see in this type of modality is that there's a need to look at the policy actions in a long-term perspective of what are the likely environmental and social impacts going to be. So under the new policy, under the old policy, the current safeguards policy, there's not specific guidance, or it's not that there's not enough information or guidance for the borrower or for ADB to assess what the likely impacts could be. So again, the risk-based approach is useful because the risk-based approach will also look at contextual risks or other long-term risks that can affect implementation of certain policies as well. So this is one of the new features that could be added to the safeguards assessment of policy loans. That first of all, the classification will identify also what type of assessment can be used for identifying long-term impacts of that policy action, or the policy actions that are proposed. So that is one thing that we are looking at for the policy-based loan. Next slide, please. Now, emergency assistance loans are provided in the case of emergencies when there are any natural disasters or any economic disasters where the government or our developing member country that we are working with requires recovery activities or requires immediate financial support for either economic, to restore economic activities or to for rehabilitation of a post-disaster situation. So in such a case, due to the urgency and due to the time constraints, it is always not possible to undertake the safeguards assessment before the loan is approved. So what is undertaken is that a framework is prepared, and that framework is then used to determine what would need to be done after the approval of that loan. So once a loan is approved, then before the financing is transferred and the construction is of that particular project starts, the safeguards documentation has to be prepared in that time. So in such cases, under the old policy, we found that the monitoring systems need to be tight and also robust so that those safeguards instruments are in fact prepared. And so this is some of the things that we need to look at under the new policy with specific guidance and specific provisions that ensure that there is no compromise or no sacrifice of the quality of the safeguards document upon upon entry. So next slide, please. So in 2019, ADB approved the policy for results-based lending, and this policy was approved after a 6-year pilot period in which certain projects were prepared using this modality. So in the results-based lending, what happens is that the financing is used to, or the funds are used to finance a share of a government's national or subnational sector or any subsector level program. So if there is a plan of a government to improve electricity transmission, or if there's a plan to construct mini or micro hydro plants, then that could be an example of or build or construct schools across the country. Then the ADB can support a part of that program, and that would then be called a results-based loan, in which the tranche or the disbursement of funds is linked to the achievement of results, that if the actual electricity is transported or if the actual result is achieved. So then in the pilot period that this was implemented, we already noticed some things that needed some strengthening. So what we do in the ADB policy on results-based lending says that for management, for an implementation and management of risks, the policies, the systems basically that are used are the government systems. So that means that in order to use those systems at the level of the program, ADB undertakes an assessment of the safeguard systems of that country. And if there are any gaps, those are identified, and a gap filling action plan is prepared. So what we see is that in this process, what we saw in the pilot plan was that there was a need to improve the systems through which the eligibility of activities was determined. And what we felt was that there was a need to factor in programmatic, institutional, and contextual risks, as well as the capacity and the commitment of the borrower to implement them. So these were things that are already identified and are now part of the new policy of the results-based lending. So what we see now is that most of our developing member countries are the readiness for using their RBL or the results-based lending modality implementation is still low. And a lot of support is needed for training on how to training borrowers on how does the RBL modality actually work, and how to undertake an assessment of the safeguard systems of the country which would be applied, and then how would that be used, how would that be monitored. So strengthening of that, and also the strengthening of monitoring systems is also needed to actually see whether the safeguards were implemented and were the safeguards outcomes achieved as was anticipated or for the purpose of that loan. Next slide, please. Now, technical assistance are basically assistance programs for our borrowers to actually develop projects. And there are knowledge technical assistances, and there are also project preparatory technical assistances. And these are used to undertake feasibility studies or detailed design studies. But recently, so these technical assistances are not used to implement projects. Therefore, there are no direct implications or risks to the environment or the social, any social or environmental impacts are not likely. So we see that unless a certain technical assistance involves a pilot project where there will be construction, where some technology is tested, in that case, that's known as a complex TA, and that is classified or categorized. And similarly, the project readiness facility, which is also a new modality, and the small expenditure financing facility is also a new modality, which is which also doesn't have any requirements for safeguards. And this type of modality is used for actually undertaking detailed design studies, which can include undertaking the environmental and social impact assessment. So this is a type of a TA that can finance doing that study. So in that case, since the project is not going to be implemented, this project will be implemented later, and that project will then be classified. Therefore, the TA is not classified. So that is for the PRF and the SEFF. So I'll hand it over to Jelson. Thank you so much, and we'll open it up for, I think, questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Zara. The way you describe those financing modalities for government operations, very useful. And so may I now call on Duncan Lang, who is our Senior Environment Specialist of SDCC, to moderate the first round of Q&A. Duncan.
Thank you very much, Jelson, and thanks for the very useful introductory presentations there from Bruce and Zara. So the way that we normally do this is we offer people to put their hands up to provide, to make direct interventions. The other alternative is, and I see we've already got one in the chat. We're very happy to take questions in the chat. We can also, quite often we can usually do a translation as well if there's somebody who wants to put in a different language as well. I'm not sure if we've got that available today, but that's normally an option. But anyway, what I would say is we would welcome any participants to jump in now. And the other thing is as well is if you feel like this is a lot of information provided here today, and you may feel like, well, I need to think about this a little bit more before giving some feedback, there's always a channel whereby you can write your feedback to us, and we can give you a further response in more detail there as well. So we don't have anybody yet with their hand up, but if there is, great, fantastic, right. So Petra Kajel Wright from Recourse. Petra, please, the floor is yours. Go ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Duncan, and very big thank you to the whole ADB team for persisting and keeping going with these consultations. It's quite refreshing. I know it's been a bit delayed, but it's really refreshing to see how you're taking this seriously. And apologies for jumping in on the Central Asia and Asia consultation, because I'm actually based in London. So Recourse is an organisation that monitors MDBs. I couldn't take part in the one yesterday that was for my region. So I'm jumping in here. I just had some questions on policy-based lending, or some recommendations in particular. We haven't actually looked much at Recourse at the ADB's policy lending portfolio, and actually one of the reasons why is it's quite hard to find out. So that's actually one of my first points, the disclosure of policy-based lending. I haven't been able to easily find an overview of what projects ADB is identifying as policy-based lending. It might just be my skills in terms of navigating your website are not as good as they should be. But that was one comment. But we have looked a lot at policy-based lending at the World Bank, and we've identified quite a few issues there in terms of loans going to even to supporting areas and sectors that the World Bank normally wouldn't do. And one of the reasons for that, I guess, is the lack of preparation, the kind of the phase before the money is dispersed, basically, which is normally when everything gets disclosed. And I would say, on a positive side, I'm really happy that ADB actually includes policy-based lending as part of the broader safeguards framework, because that's a fight we've had at the World Bank, which hasn't been successful to date. World Bank keeps a separate operational policy, and I think a lot of the problem stems from that it sits completely separately and has its own very vague rules that aren't as strict as they should be. And I think it's really welcome. I really welcome ADB to continue to keep policy-based lending as part of this framework, which it seems like you are planning to do. But there's are more steps to be done. I think one of the main issues is around this kind of policy action phase, and even the World Bank actually advises borrowers to consult on the prior actions, as they call them, the policy actions. And I think that's something we'd really welcome ADB to do as well, to have a proper consultation phase before, as those policy actions are being formulated. Because as we know, once they've been ticked, then the money is dispersed and it's very hard to track where the money actually goes. But those policies can have a real positive impact, but also a real negative impact. And that's where we've been tracking the negative impacts at the World Bank. So that phase is so important. So we really welcome the ADB to make sure that in the guidance note and in the SPS itself, that consultation is taken seriously, and that it's a requirement, it's mandatory. So that was one thing. And also in terms of disclosure, apart from making it easier for us to find these loans in the database, also to make sure that all information about the loans per se, about the policy action, what kind of laws and policies and investment frameworks they will feed into, is also really important. So kind of going one step further in terms of what information is available to communities in particular. So those were my points on that. And actually, just a final point on the guidance notes. So you mentioned that there will be guidance notes on all the different financial modalities. And I just wanted to understand whether those guidance notes will be consulted upon, because obviously that's where we as civil society and as stakeholders can really help ADB shape them in a way that make them useful and stronger. So just a question on that for you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Petra. That was a really great start for us there to get into the weeds on this a little bit. So I think I'll turn over to Bruce initially for this one. There's quite a bit to unpack there, Bruce. So I think it would be interesting maybe just to hear where we are and where you feel like we're going, because there's some of this stuff I think we do, but there's some stuff I think we're going to expand on in the new policy in terms of disclosure, and what we're doing, where the money is going, and so on. So that there's lots to unpack there. So perhaps I'll turn over to you now for first reactions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Duncan, and thanks so much, Petra. Glad you could join today, even though you weren't able to join the session yesterday. So yeah, great set of points that you've raised already. So let me try and work through some of those. So yeah, firstly on disclosure, and I think what you were talking about there is finding the information that is available on our website. It is all there, but I think we recognise it could be organised in perhaps a more accessible way. There is a database. There's a way for you to search, and all of the safeguard documents, including assessments for policy-based lending, are there. But you've got to be able to go to the project and work project by project. But we are looking at strengthening that as part of the whole rollout of the policy work. Still something we've got to do some more work on, but we're thinking of having sort of a consolidated environmental and social safeguards disclosure page, where it's sort of like a one-stop shop that consolidates, where you'd be able to say, here's the most recent documents that have been disclosed. Perhaps we can look at by modality or different ways of organizing it. But yeah, it's just making it easier, I think, for people and organizations like yourselves to be able to access that. So that's the first one. On the policy framework, so this has been something we've had a bit of discussion on, actually, because some people have said, oh, why are you doing it differently to the World Bank? They've got a standard on financial intermediaries. Shouldn't you have one of those? And we've had to say, well, actually, no, we've got more than that. And that's why we're having a separate set of requirements that covers all of the lending and financing modalities, not just financial intermediaries. So we do think it's important to keep policy-based lending there. We have an existing annex in the current policy that covers some of this, but we're revisiting that, and we're looking to most likely expand it and provide some clarifications. And then the guidance notes, so there will be guidance notes. That will be something we'll start work on as we're still developing the policy, but they will be finalized after the policy has been approved. So we've got real clarity on what's ultimately agreed, and then we'll embark in that next stage. We will put them out for consultation, so it will give another chance to look at the details of that. And then I think on the assessment, you made some really great points on the policy actions and the timing of that. And this has actually been sometimes a challenge for us, where you come in and the government's already been working on a policy reform program, and they've got some actions that they've achieved, and that they're looking for financial support to be able to cover the incremental costs of those. So it makes it challenging if you only come in at that stage and the policy reforms have already been achieved. Now, in those cases, we still do assessment. We put together a matrix, as Sarah was explaining earlier, and we would look at all of the policy reform actions. We would screen them around environmental and social risks, looking at both direct and indirect impacts. And then you would look at, are there any consequences of that? And do we need to propose then any additional measures to address those? But those measures need to be at the policy level. And so you then have to, if necessary, propose additional policy measures or propose changes in the policy framework. So, clearly the earlier you get involved in that process, the better. So that's something that we've been discussing. If you get in early, you can also use tools like strategic environmental and social assessment to support that process. So it is an area to look at. I think a few strengthening measures that we're looking at right now, I'll just mention quickly because some of these came up in the consultation yesterday. Greater focus on indirect impacts tends to be from the governments and some of the assessment processes. There's been a tendency to just look at direct impacts, but it's indirect that also matters. Secondly, the policy matrix as a tool is still pretty robust, but it's really the level of analysis. And we do think you've got to focus more on what the risks are and study those in more detail. And then thirdly, it's these opportunities for upstream strategic engagement where possible. So they're three things that we're thinking about. But I'm sure there'll be more questions and comments on policy-based lending. In the last couple of consultations, there's been a lot. So I'll stop there and we can come back for further discussions on it. Thanks.
Bruce, do you have any feeling on the guidance note? There was a mention that we will have a guidance note that will come with the new. Well, there will be with the new policy, but with respect to the modalities specifically, do you want to respond on that one just quickly?
Yeah, for the guidance notes, including if we have guidance notes for the modalities we still need to look at. I think we'll need to have some explanatory notes on them, which we'll need to make public because also clients will need to understand this as well. We're looking still at the process for how that would be done. We'll prepare drafts, and I think we'll disclose those publicly for comment. And in the later stage, we expect to have some consultations on that. We need to do it fairly efficiently, though, because we have to have the whole policy framework, including the guidance, ready before the rollout. So we do anticipate having some consultation on it, but it probably won't be as lengthy and as extensive as we've been doing in this current preparation phase. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Bruce. So we have, at the moment, no further hands raised. So I will go to a question we have in the chat from Sandesh Hamal from WWF. Oh, I see. Just before, well, let me finish this one since I've started. That seems fair. From WWF. So this is related to capacity building measures for borrowers and clients. So the question is, who pays for this? And the guidance to borrowers and clients in selecting ES assessment tools. Will there be any, I guess? And will there be an incentive mechanism tied to, I guess, using those? So a few things to unpack there. I think, Sandesh, I can say from being in the operations department, we already do quite a bit of this in capacity building with borrowers and clients. But I'll turn over to Zara Abbas, who can give you some further details of what we do now and also where we're thinking of going in the future. Over to you, Zara.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Sandesh. Okay, so for what we currently have in our what we do, our current practice for capacity building is that there are several mechanisms to do that. First, sometimes we have technical assistance programs which are regional and focus on certain types of capacity building for our borrowing member countries and our clients. Or there can be technical assistances again linked to a certain project and that build capacity of the client. Or another form is that when we are once the loan is approved and there are different players involved. There is the contractor who's implementing or constructing the project. We have supervision consultants who are supervising that project, and then there is also our borrower overseeing the whole process. So in there also there are certain capacity building, but that takes place at the level of the contractors, or it can also be through ADB for the client. So there are different forms of capacity building interventions that can take place, or we do have currently, and these are likely to continue in the new policy. Also, we'll have a similar sort of arrangements, possibly better coordinated and maybe more focused on the capacity needs of that particular sector or that agency, or from the perspective of any regional area. So that is likely to happen as well. Now, clearly the capacity building is a grant, which mostly is in terms of who pays for it, it would be ADB. And if it's part of a loan, and if it's directed at the building capacity of a contractor for implementing a project, then that is sometimes part of the loan. But mostly, predominantly, it's ADB that pays for these capacity building programs. So that is how we are doing it now, and we plan to do it later also. Now, the next part of your question is guidance to borrower client in selecting the environmental social assessment tool. So under the new policy, I presume you're asking. So under the new policy, there will be two steps. The first step is that once a project concept is identified or is brought forward, then the classification of the risk of that particular future project would be identified. And the risk is assigned, the risk classification would be assigned by ADB in discussion with the client or the borrower, because the client and the borrower would have country-specific information, or would have country-specific knowledge or sector-specific knowledge or agency-specific knowledge, which would be very important for us to identify the exact type of risk of that project. So once that risk is identified, then ADB will communicate that to the client or the borrower, and together they will identify a scoping exercise will take place, and that scoping exercise will essentially identify what type of assessment needs to take place, and that would be proportionate to the risk. So if there are risks in a certain area, like if there are biodiversity risks and it's needed that there needs to be a biodiversity study or an assessment needs to take place, if there's critical habitat, a critical habitat assessment needs to take place, then the plan that needs to be prepared would then be identified as one of the assessments that have to be undertaken. So then that would be the type of environmental social assessment tool, and that would also be linked to the technical assistance for project preparation. So that is how, if you're asking about incentive mechanism to undertake the study, project preparation, it would probably become part of the project preparatory TA, the TRTA, the transactional TA, which is now, it's called now. So I hope I answered your questions. Extremely long answer, sorry about that, but I wanted to explain it properly. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Maybe I could just add as well, ADB, we're actually working very closely with in fact, WWF, and what we're hoping to do is develop some upstream tools. In fact, Nepal is one of the countries that we're very keen to work in, and we're looking to do a project with the GEF, and this would be an assessment kind of upstream, so that projects that then come out of that are following the full extent of the mitigation hierarchy to try and avoid impacts as much as possible. So I suspect, Sandesh, you will hear more about that in the coming years and probably be heavily involved in it. So that's probably something to give you a smile on a Friday. Right, so next we saw Anne Pereiras, you had your hand up. So Anne, and then you kindly put it down. So perhaps, Anne, if you'd like to come in now, the floor is yours if you'd like to raise your questions now.
All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. This is Anne from NGO Forum on ADB. And apologies too, I was not able to join the consultation for the region in Southeast Asia. But nonetheless, thank you for providing the opportunity as well. So my three quick questions and or comments pertain on MFF, TAs, and emergency assistance loans. For the first point on multi-tranche financing facility, from the forum end, we are pleased to note the inclusion of the issues for consideration, particularly this point on the risk classification should factor in the scale of the entire loan. Because in our experience, for instance, in monitoring certain projects, particularly in India, the Kolkata Environmental Investment Program and the Accelerating for Infrastructure Investment project, what we have noted is precisely because of the nature of the loan, that it is MFF, it was quite difficult as well to determine which part of the tranche the particular issues arises from. So if the trajectory now in moving forward for the safeguards is to look at it from the entire scope of the scale of the entire loan itself, then I think that would really be beneficial for the groups monitoring this particular type of financing modality. That's one. But then at the second point, we would also like to reiterate that, like what Petra have mentioned, precisely because it is an MFF, it's also quite difficult to determine which tranche the specific issues is coming from. And in that note as well, I think we will also bring this up when we're talking about the review of the accountability mechanism because it is quite difficult for the communities to identify which tranche. So if we were just like focusing on the entire loan, then I think that would also be very useful for the communities on the ground. On the second point on TAs, I think I would just like to caution in terms of the statement in terms of there are not a lot of complexities or issues when we're talking about TAs. For this particular project, this is not under Central or South Asia, and it doesn't involve civil works, so it is not classified as a complex one. But I'd also like to bring it to the attention in terms of the TA, at least in Samoa, wherein it involved the alienation of customary land under the TA that is being funded by ADB. Again, not just because there are no civil works involved, or it is just in that nature of TA, then it wouldn't pose some risks as well to the communities. So I'd also just like to bring caution in terms of how do we adequately do due diligence when we're talking about TAs. And then on the last point in terms of emergency assistance loans, where's EAL? Okay, so for the EALs, I'd also like to share in terms of our experience for monitoring EALs. We note for a fact that since the nature of EALs, it has to be done in a speedy manner. But for instance, in the case of the Philippines, when we try to seek for comments in terms of how was the funds actually being tracked down and disbursed down to the specific communities, what we have experienced is that it was already commingled with the national government fund, and there is no specific mechanism in terms of monitoring it per se. And there were also like issues in terms of some of the rehabilitation component that was raised before. So again, moving forward, it would really be useful in terms of having those better monitoring mechanisms, even if it's an emergency assistance loans. I think that's all on my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Very good points there. So we've got three really there to deal with, which is first off is on the MFFs and how we can better get clarity on issues within the MFF and looking at the overall MFF and rating the risks against that and where the issues are, and how you're finding it difficult to find out issues within the MFF, and how people find it difficult to, complain to the accountability mechanism potentially as well. The second one relating to Samoa and a project which was a TA and how that contributed to some land issues there. And then the last one is the tracking of emergency assistant loan money, where it actually goes in the end. So perhaps if I can go to you, Bruce, to start off, and then we can bring in other colleagues if we need to add a little bit more. Bruce, over to you first.
Great. Thanks very much, Duncan. And thanks, Anne. Good to see you. Always appreciate NGO Forum joining a lot of these sessions. So for the MFF, I think you make a great point. MFFs are designed to have a long-term program, a 10-year financing package, and they would normally have one and typically more sub-projects. Sometimes they can have one large project that's financed over a long-term period, tranches of financing, let's say for a big infrastructure project that's going to be developed in several phases, or it can be individual sub-projects. But I think that the key point that you're making is a good one, that you do need to look at the entire program and look to see if there are any strategic environmental and social issues or cumulative impacts that would occur as part of that. I think you can do this by having a more robust risk screening process and then focusing on ones that would have significant strategic or cumulative impacts to have some wider assessment. So I think that's an area that we can look at and have been having some discussions within the team on. For the technical assistance, so most of our technical assistance goes to initial project preparation for the governments. We have this modality called a transactional technical assistance. So it basically helps the government to prepare a project. And when we do that, the safeguards are part of that technical assistance already. And then it's the project itself that the safeguards are then applied to. So safeguards are already basically built into that process. But then we have other TAs for different types of purposes, often for knowledge development and capacity building. We don't think that should have a safeguards filter because it's really about building capacity. And we don't want to overburden the system and make it to the point where we can't do knowledge work without having the sort of transactional cost of a lot of things. But I do think where you're pointing in the case from Samoa is actually a bit of a fine line sometimes with the policy-based lending. In the Samoa case, there was technical assistance to support the government to evaluate different policy options. But it was different to a policy-based loan because the policy itself, the approval of that was not part of the program. It was something that the government would take up later. And usually the technical assistance is to provide consulting services, to do studies. And then it's really, governments can take that forward. They may take ADB advice and recommendations or consultant advice and recommendations, but it's technical assistance. It's not a binding commitment on a policy framework that we can require certain policy actions of them. It's not what the modality is intended for. But we are looking at this and considering, are there certain types of TAs that you might need to do some additional screening on and to see if there are some potential risks? And, certainly anything that involves land reforms on customary land or a change in land use or incentives that may affect the way that land is used could have issues. And I personally would think, looking at environmental and social issues is relevant. But, how to do that effectively with a technical assistance modality that's really designed for different purposes. Not so simple, but we're certainly thinking that through, and be happy to have other comments and suggestions on it. Then for the emergency assistance loans, so here we're trying to balance a couple of things. The emergency assistance is usually triggered rapidly and it has to be approved within a short period of time. And we try to use a framework approach so that we can get financing, particularly financing that's needed for essential services immediately. We try to get money to that quickly. But the framework is then there to say, if you're going to be doing additional activities later that involve safeguard risks, you still need to do all of the safeguard project preparation, but it's done later. So the borrower can get some money for some immediate activities that should not have safeguard risks, but then they can move forward with further project preparation. So that's the approach. We think that's still an important way to go about it to provide this flexibility in emergency situations. But yeah, I'd be happy to hear from you again. I may have missed a little bit. My daughter came in at one stage when you were talking. So, perhaps to hear from you a little bit more about, you were talking about funding being commingled with the government and their implementation and the need to monitor that more closely. I think monitoring is certainly an area that could be strengthened, but if you had some further suggestions, please come back in. Thanks.
And if you do have any further feedback, you're welcome to jump back in now if Bruce has missed anything there. But if not, I can continue on.
It's okay, Bruce. I think we can just continue that via email, particularly with our experience on the Tacloban emergency assistance loan.
Oh yeah, that'd be interesting. Thanks,
Okay.
Anne. Yeah, I was actually online the other day listening to it was a podcast on the experiences 10 years on from Tacloban. So yeah, I'd be interested in taking that up with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne and Bruce. Okay, so we have a next question from Pranay Kumar. So there's kind of three parts to this, but I think it really relates to the end point there is important, which is the World Bank with their new ESF faced a number of challenges with rolling out their policy when that came out. And so the question is how, do we see rolling out ours? So I think the key points are we're going to have additional documentation. It's not necessarily clear from Pranay's perspective whether that's going to give additional value, and where you've got multiple documents, making sure that they all align with each other is a challenge. There seems to be ever-changing guidance from what reviewers want, and flexibility with the ESF is good in some senses, but not if you're an environment specialist. So I think there's some good things there that we can learn from, hopefully. I think one of the things that I would just initially say as a reviewer is, in an ADB context, is we don't have guidance. And so, having the guidance that will go with our, ESS standards will actually be very helpful, because we will know, hopefully, the product that we're getting when it comes to us from the borrowers or clients will hopefully be more consistent. But that's just my quick feedback. Perhaps I can turn over to Bruce initially, if you've got any feedback on those points, Bruce. And others are welcome to join after that. Over to you, Bruce.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So thank you, Pranay. This is a really important issue, and sometimes when you're so focused on the policy, you're not looking up to see where you're going with the rollout process. But we are starting to focus on that next phase already, and have been talking to the World Bank actually. We've been engaging with them to try and pick up some of the lessons learned, and I think there's a few crucial things. Like, we need to be able to get the guidance material prepared quite quickly. So we're going to start doing that as we're finalizing the policy preparation, so that we can take that into training materials and awareness raising materials for our own staff, and then train trainers from our own staff, and then be able to start to build that capacity with our clients and borrowers. We're also thinking about different tools we can use, e-learning materials, videos, as well as in-country presence for all of this. I do think your point on flexibility is a good one. We're trying to focus on real risks and focusing on the issues that matter, and make sure that they're assessed adequately, that they're managed adequately, but also the potential for some adaptive management. And that will be a change in focus. Currently, we focus on upfront preparation, but I think we've not necessarily had as much focus or as much resources as we'd like to on the implementation. And that's another piece that we've got to strengthen as part of the rollout for this. So there is a lot to do, and we obviously have to get that right. So we're talking to World Bank. Sarah's also been in touch to look at sort of what we can expedite from some of the materials that they've already prepared. Sarah, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add there.
No, just briefly that yes, we've been discussing this with the World Bank as well. And in addition to that, we'll also have very comprehensive internal trainings as well, so that our own staff is able to better guide the borrowers in how to bridge the gap between the risk assessment and the actual assessment that would need to take place. So the rollout would be over different phases, would have different tiers of training, and which would cover different at different depths, maybe, and also for our project officers who are initiating the loan with the government. So that's all. So yep, we totally understand this, and we've also had similar feedback from consultants who have worked with the World Bank that it has been very difficult. So we want to learn from that also. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think we'll wrap up there. I mean, just maybe one last thing to say from my side, that you know, it's no good from an ADB perspective if our reviewers are, you know, giving high or low feedback. We want consistency across everybody, and so internal, you know, capacity building and training will be just as important for us for ADB as well as externally as well to our borrowers and clients. With that, maybe I can turn back to Gelson, and then we can go to the second phase of the presentation. Gelson, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, and our panel of respondents from ADB. I think I will say we received very substantive, if you like, substantive and technical comments, and the points are quite clear. So it's time for coffee, tea, or maybe a glass of water, and let's pause for a 5-minute break. And after that, we'll have a presentation, this time focused on the private sector financing modalities. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. Thanks. So welcome back. Let's now move to the second presentation on the financing modalities. This time it will be Felix Oku. So building on the presentation from Zara, who focused on the sovereign financing modalities, the focus this time is on the private sector operations, and Felix will describe those different financing modalities for private sector operations, the safeguards.
Yeah, Felix, I think Gelson was disconnected. Over to you to proceed with the next session.
Yeah, sure.
Operations. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And let me warmly welcome you back again to the second session of our presentation. Thanks to Zara and all of you, including Bruce and the team, for those insightful discussions that followed the first presentation. So this session is titled Private Sector Operations, but just want to explain that we'll be talking about three main financing modalities, two of which are predominantly used by ADB's private sector operations, and the other one, which is financial intermediation or financial intermediaries, as they're popularly known, is used both by the sovereign as well as the private sector arms of ADB. We go to the next slide, please. The SPS has been effective for well over a decade from its effectiveness in 2010. Within that decade, the whole world within private sector finance has evolved and has changed quite dramatically. The ID report noted that there is little information to enable private sector financing to be guided by safeguards instruments. Within that time frame, our private sector operations have adopted innovative mechanics of finance and have deployed different financing instruments in their transactions. This includes the traditional financial intermediary work, or financial intermediaries as it's called, and that goes for non-banks and banks, private equity funds, but as well as transactions within the capital market, including bonds, so green, blue, and social bonds, or sustainability bonds, as we call them. Our trade and supply chain finance program has also benefited immensely, and in many instances as well, we've had initial public offerings transactions that has been done. Overall, clients, unlike in the past, have come to have appreciation for the value addition of having to develop the safeguards instruments that are required by the safeguards policies system. The development of ESMS have now come to be appreciated by a lot of corporate entities, and they pride that with the acquisition of international certifications that go with it. Next slide, please. So we'll be looking at three mentioned financing instruments. The first one is another one that is quite very traditional to private sector financing, called project finance. And project finance is just a structured financing for a specific economic activity. In most instances, these are underpinned by infrastructure finance, but limited instances as well. They're also business processes, where a dedicated project company is formed in the particular DMC, and that project company is usually called a special purpose vehicle, or SPV for short. And the cash flow from that project company, or SPV, is what is used to service the loan or the debt that is procured from ADB. With project finance, they propose infrastructure to be developed with the use of the proceeds are quite very clear at the onset of the project development. A project company is already incorporated or will be incorporated. So it's quite very, let's say, a bit more plain vanilla straight to apply the safeguard requirement 1 to 3, whichever one applies or is triggered would necessitate the preparation of assessment report and management planning to address potential environmental and social impacts. Because private sector operations enters into transactions at different stages of the development of those transactions, typically infrastructure, it's also not uncommon to have ADB entering into a project where the project has already commenced in terms of the civil works. In those cases, our special requirement 4, which covers also existing facilities, applies, where an audit will be done on the existing conditions, that's a safeguard arrangement on the existing facility, and where gaps are identified, a time-bound corrective action plan will be put in place. The audit is what we refer to as the Environmental and Social Compliance Audit, or ESCA. For Category A environmental-based projects, the mandatory 120-day disclosure requirement applies to the ESCA and any corrective action plan that will be disclosed. What are we proposing as part of the SPS policy update to help make the project finance a bit more nimble and be able to respond quite in an adaptive way to our clients? A lot of our sister institutions or comparators apply what we call compliance over time. The SPS, in many instances or in principle, is very much front-loaded in that a lot of the safeguards assessment needs to be prepared prior to board approval. In many cases, it doesn't offer the client the flexibility to be quite very adaptive with allocation of resources to address key safeguards issues during project implementation. A flexibility with the introduction of what we call the Environmental and Social Action Plan, or ESAP, or the Environmental and Social Commitment Plan, ESCP, will be quite very beneficial and offer that kind of adaptive approach to allow project companies that approach ADB to be able to address key safeguards issues over time rather than rush it and not allocate the adequate resources. We go to the next slide, which talks about corporate finance. And we start with general corporate finance. So general corporate finance, by virtue of its name, is a debt or equity to a corporate entity, and the use of proceeds are not earmarked or targeted for implementing specific sub projects. So in many instances, a corporate or portfolio approach is what the SPS takes in the risk assessment, because it's to a corporate entity, and the ESMS audit will be done on that corporate entity. If there are gaps that are identified with the ESMS, including capacity and commitment to implement that ESMS, then the time-bound corrective action plan would also be set aside. Quite similar to that is what we call corporate finance. And that corporate finance, the only difference between that and the general corporate finance is corporate finance that the proceeds that are procured from ADB, either debt or equity, are earmarked for specific sub projects. So in those cases, then the asset class approach is what is adopted in the risk assessment. And similar to the project finance, if ADB were to enter into that transaction at a stage where the transaction has already started, or it's an existing facility which is scheduled for rehabilitation, modernization, expansion, then our existing facilities requirement applies as per ISR 4, and the audit report plus any time-bound corrective action plan will be scheduled for disclosure per our ISR 1 to 3 requirement. Again, the 120-day mandatory disclosure period prior to board approval applies for environment category A. What are some of the key considerations that we're tabling for the SPS update? We think, given where current market response, a corporate finance approach, an overall corporate finance approach in terms of modality may be a better approach than the separation between the general and corporate finance. A corporate finance which addresses both transactions across the debt and the equity pipeline, with adaptive mechanisms to allow ADB to deploy safeguards to allow the client to be able to meet those safeguard requirements across the entire project cycle and not just front loading it. The ESMS will still be the key safeguards instrument. That's the environmental social management system, but there's a need to strengthen the way the ESMS is assessed, the way it is audited, and the way it's implemented and reported on throughout the project development cycle, with a key emphasis on the client commitment and capacity to implement. Transactions on the capital market, I've just mentioned green, blue, social, or sustainability bonds. There's a need also for some kind of mechanism to address there, especially with that limited information as of the point where those IPOs are being issued. Monitoring and disclosure of information is critical, and it should be underpinned by restrictions within DMC legislation or regulatory requirement, and sensitivity to the market. What is also another important point that should be considered has to be disclosure of critical or sensitive information belonging to corporate entities that would disadvantage them against their competitors. Next slide, please. So we thought before we talk about the third financing instrument, which is financial intermediaries or financial intermediation, we give you an overview of our portfolio, the existing portfolio of ADB's FI. And the first slide you see on your left is the spread of our portfolio across both the private sector operations and then the sovereign arm. And you can see clearly that private sector drives the FI portfolio business of ADB with well over 70% of our portfolio resting with the private sector. We thought it was also very good to give a flavor of the kind of risk profile of our current existing FI portfolio. And the data you see there dates back from 2010, where the SPS became effective up until 2021. So you see our typical portfolio across both the private and the sovereign are quite of a very low risk appetite. The portfolio is predominantly FI treated as C. In ADB, we have two categories of FI. So there's FI treated as C and FI. And FI treated as C by definition is similar to what you have a category C across the three safeguards. But why it is denoted as FI, then it means it has the capacity to take sub-projects or sub-loans or sub-investee activities, which could potentially be category A or category B. As of now, we only have three, just want to make very clear, three FIs that can take category A sub-projects. And these are three FIs that we've worked with over time, extensively over a period to ensure they have the capacity to be able to take those projects. It's also important to stress that as part of our referral process, all FIs a category A sub-project from FIs are referred back to ADB to ensure that the appropriate due diligence, public participation, and disclosure requirements per the SPS are met. So the slide you see on the right is the spread across the sovereign and the private sector operations on the environment safeguard category. And if you look on the sovereign side, it clearly shows you that a bigger part of the portfolio is FI treated as C. On the environment side, if you look on the private sector side, there's a bit more upgrade on the kind of risk on the portfolio, where the bulk is within FI. But again, as I explained, only three. So the bulk majority of the FI within the private sector operations is those that are category B. Next slide will show us the spread across the involuntary settlement and indigenous people safeguard category. And you can clearly also see there from the left-hand side, the FI portfolio across the involuntary settlement on the public side is quite very low risk, FI treated C. And then that also on the both on the private side give the same trend basically. It's important to note here that a lot of the FI transactions that we do, especially in the private sector side, has to do with micro, small, medium enterprises with loan ticket sizes ranging between a couple of thousands and a couple of tens of thousands. And that's probably the reason why you see that. In the sovereign side, we do have a bit more complex structuring of FI where double intermediation has happened in some cases. And we can talk about that. Next slide, please. So we want to now talk about the FI, and I've mentioned that the FI modality is used for banks and non-banks, private equity funds. It's also used for our trade and supply chain finance program. Basically applies both loans, debt, equity, and guarantee and credit lines. I won't go into much details, but I've mentioned the two categories of FIs that we have. The approach is the ESMS, and where gaps are found, corrective actions are put into place. A lot of these are also linked to disbursement where we think the need is necessary. And for Cat A FIs, they are referred back to ADB, disclosure requirements are met. What are the things that are being tabled as part of the SPS update? Guidance. I think guidance was what ID report was entirely mentioning. Guidance to provide clarity to our borrowers and clients on the requirement and that of ADB in assessing our client's capacity and assessing the adequacy of the ESMS per SPS requirement. Disclosure of FI information has also come to the fray in many instances. Again, in line with what legislative requirements pertain within the MCs, and market sensitivities, as well as commercial confidential information of clients. To mitigate against restrictions and headroom and overcrowding within the development space, we typically always, with our FI work, do co-finance. So harmonization with our sister institutions will be quite very, and that's the reason why we're leveraging a lot, for instance, towards the IFC interpretation note and other sister institutions who have adopted some standards or interpretation notes or guidance that are similar to that. We go to the next slide, please. So the IED report had indicated that the FI portfolio spread, as I showed you in the graph there, private sector operations, in many instances, the FI was as good as or better than that for the sovereign. So internally within the ADB, there is some kind of knowledge transfer that needs to happen. It mentions the need for us to strengthen our ECMS, mention the need to develop guidance, and the need to make sure we strengthen client capacity, especially for high risk FI. And those are the recommendations that I've listed. They're happy to answer any questions that may come on that. In many instances, although we don't have a labor standard or labor working conditions standard, like some of our peer institutions, we have labor and working conditions issues to address through either corporate strategies and policies. We have nonetheless, especially for our private sector operations, a leverage on provisions within IFC PS2 and others when we co-finance to make sure issues with labor and working conditions are addressed. And my last slide is we've tried to benchmark and see how we compare with our peer or sister institutions within the spirit of harmonization. What you have there is the ADB SPS, IFC, because that's the private arm of the World Bank Group, the EBRD, because it's a regional bank like ourselves, IDB Invest also is a private arm of the Inter-American Development Bank, and then a cluster of European development banks that are called EDFIs. For those of you who know POPAC or DEG, FMO, and co, they form under that cluster of banks. Just to see how we compare, because for EBRD and IDB, for instance, we're quite very similar in terms of business model, and in particular with IFC and EBRD, there's some kind of overlap in geographical coverage in the area of our business. Years of approval. What is interesting is the approach to where we assess risk. I think there's alignment of ADB there. Asset class approach is what is adopted for debt, where there's equity investment like general purpose, general corporate, then we do have a portfolio approach, and that's cut across, except the European developing financial institutions. And that is triggered by a particular European directive. Exclusion zone, all the MDBs or EDFIs have their own exclusion zones. Double intermediation is allowed, yes, but that also comes with additional control. Where we do differ, though, has to do with disclosure of information. And you can see that uniquely, a lot of our peer institutions or sister institutions do have 60 days for their private sector arm of business in terms of disclosure. ADB still maintains the 120 days for category A when it comes back. And the next two, the rows just provides information of the policies that underpin the disclosure requirement for the institutions. I think I may have to end here because I'm sure others would like to come in and ask some thought-provoking questions, which we're going to have let us be able to discuss this in much more detail. Over to you, Jelson.
Thank you. Felix, am I still loud and clear? Please confirm.
Yes, I can hear you now loud and clear.
Okay. Thanks for catching me on that earlier. So let's very, very good, instructive. And I think the way you have made a comparison on the different financing modalities, the safeguards required, including financial intermediary, which has always been one of the main important topics of engagement with civil societies. Some of them are represented here, often have conversation around FIs and safeguards. So comparing them with peer MFIs is very, very useful. And so, and I know that Bruce also shared again those acronyms so that we won't get lost. So may I call on Duncan again to moderate the second round of the Q&A. Duncan.
Thank you, Jelson, and thanks also Felix for the useful presentation there. There's a lot of information to digest there for our viewers today, but I would say as before, if you have more detailed comments or you need more time to digest, please do have a look at the report that I think we've shared the link to and you're welcome to write to us. We hope that the list of acronyms is helpful. We had some feedback from some earlier sessions that it was a bit complicated and people needed to understand them. So we hope that that's helpful for you. So we don't have any written questions just yet. So if anybody has interest to jump in and put their hand up, now is the time to do it. We have some framing questions there just to get your thought juices going. But if not, we can have a think about some further questions that I can possibly get the conversation going. But I would very much welcome anybody who wants to put their hand up for any initial questions. FI is something that we do regularly get questioned about by our stakeholders. It is complicated, but we're doing our best to improve it through the new policy. So this is the time to voice your thoughts on it and how we can improve. So the floor is open for anybody to jump in with initial feedback. And as I said, if you don't feel like you'd like to do that, you're very welcome to write a question in the chat box, and then I can speak out the question, and you can also write to us as well. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Sandesh. So we do have a question. I will start with that. So FI risk-based audit programs and CAP, does it include insurance arrangements, and does ADB have any role in facilitating the process? Perhaps I can turn to Felix, and Felix, if you need to ask Sandesh for some further clarity, feel free to do that as well. Felix, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan, and thanks Sandesh for the question. I may need a bit more clarity on the kind of insurance. I mean, there are different types of categories of insurance. Is it insurance for workers, insurance for insurance as a guarantee for the debt that is provided, equity? That it will be good if he can clarify, and then I'll be able to give some more appropriate question. If you're there, Sandesh. It looks like it's not.
Okay, so Sandesh has responded there for you, Felix, both internal and external factors, if that's helpful.
Maybe I would, let me focus on the internal, because we're talking about the FI. And so we're talking about the financial intermediary as of the point where we're doing environmental and social due diligence. Setting up a system, the environmental and social management system is a set of policy, procedures, and systems which are underpinned by a very strong borrower's capacity and commitment for implementation. So some of these policies based upon maybe what a client's main business is. For banking institutions, for instance, we look at the audit, and we also look at maybe labor and working conditions applying to the workers in the bank. That may stray to working conditions that may include maybe insurance policies that pertain to workers for various reasons, like it does for every other worker in any corporate entity. I may then also look, if I look in that cases, but we're not looking at the ADB in terms of credits. We'll be looking at maybe other insurance. I'm talking of insurance purely within the context of safeguards. Our trade and supply chain finance program, and Lawrence is on the call, so maybe you could provide some more information as well. It may in itself provide guarantees in cases which you could define to be guarantees, could be insurance for a debt repayment, just in case that that debt or that transaction get default, or maybe there's some export risks associated with that transaction. But beyond that, we're looking at the insurance. If it's anything insurance to do with the credit, then it's beyond safeguards. Hopefully, Sandesh, does that answer your question?
Maybe one thing to add on that as well. I know that our private sector colleagues also do a ESG rating, So that looks into the risks for each FI that they will be assessing as well. So, and that's actually using existing rating agencies that are out there, and that considers the ESG risk associated with the borrower. Felix, do you want to say anything about that? Because I know that's something they do.
Sandesh, whilst you were speaking, has responded to say thanks for the insights there. But you're absolutely right. I mean, more broadly these days, we're looking beyond just environment and social. The governance element of it has been thrown in a mix, and a lot of corporate institutions are using not just for ticking the boxes, but for recognition, reputational enhancements, and branding. And there are global agencies that sort of rate them based upon this. So yeah, in those cases, there is a much more comprehensive review of institutional policies and procedures that gets involved within it beyond just environment and social.
Thanks, Felix. I think that's really says it quite well. So not sure if Sandesh, if we've fully answered your question there. I think you said earlier on, as Felix said, that we had, but if not, you feel free to come back. This is the time to do so. Okay, we got a thumbs up. Great. Okay, if anybody else is keen to come in, now is the time again. We definitely have. Okay, Petra, I see your hand is up, so please, the floor is yours. Thank you for filling that.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to come in again and occupy the space. I know my colleagues have talked a lot about FIs, and I'm trying to think of something that they haven't already asked. So I know my colleague Marge joined one consultation, and my colleague Kate tried to join yesterday. So I might leave those for now. I had questions about the capital markets. What do you call them? Transactions, I think you call them, which I don't think you covered.
Capital market transactions, you're right.
Yeah, it wasn't covered in the presentation now, I think, but it was covered in the paper. And this is something we're seeing. So another bank I'm monitoring perhaps a bit more closer than the ADB is AIB, where they've actually ramped up the capital markets kind of investments. And doing a lot of work on that. Again, I'm less familiar with how much investments ADB has done into this kind of arrangement so far. But one of the concerns we had at the AIB is that the AIB decided that they wouldn't sit in the environmental and social framework, that they would be excluded and be completely run by these separate frameworks that, for example, ESG investments normally has. We are concerned about that, and we would like to see ADB explicitly including these kind of investments under the SPS, because there's lots of risks, and I think a number of times these kind of ESG frameworks have been exposed for actually not being rigorous enough. There's not enough oversight, and even with the examples that AIB has come forward with, we haven't actually seen any transparency in terms of where the investments actually land. So just an encouragement for ADB to take this a little bit more seriously, because I think there is a general trend across the MDBs to putting more investment in these so-called kind of green frameworks. They're often kind of labeled as green, but we're not always certain that they really are as green as they should be. So I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about your thinking on this topic and where ADB is at the moment. So that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Petra. Well, we're in luck because we have Lawrence on the call today, and Lawrence is working in this space on a day-to-day basis. So, Lawrence, do you want to give some feedback on your thoughts on, using of those ESG frameworks and where, our sort of growing interest in capital markets transactions, and where you see we're going with the new safeguard policy? Over to you.
Yeah, so I can share a little bit about that with my from my direct involvement. So I think from the like of green bonds, blue bonds, sustainability linked loan, green, and the like of those. I think one thing is we can confirm that the safeguards apply. So we definitely do not apply different standards to those projects. Now, the way ADB approached this more frequently than not is we are coming in at the early stage. So we are helping the clients set up their frameworks of the bonds or the loans. This gives us a lot of opportunities to work with them on their, on their KPIs, on how they appraise their projects, and measuring the performances of the loans. So we have advantages on that. If we're not, and I can think of a project that I'm working on, we are also
WhatsApp call from Trudy, New Manila.
I am also what was that? I'm also aware that at least we must apply the safeguard categorization ENS assessment to the sub-project. So this is, I think, in a nutshell, we do apply the safeguards to that, and we and beyond that. So we are definitely involved and looking carefully at the KPIs and measurements of the performances. Yeah. Felix, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think you touched on the salient points there, Lawrence. But if I just may add a couple more points to it, Petra. ADB had been in the sustainability or sustainable bonds space for a while. I think if you look into our web pages, 2015, we've been able to do some deals in there, and like Lawrence said, the SPS did apply. A lot of these bonds, green, blue, social bonds, do have frameworks, and the green bond principles, the blue bond principles, and what they call them, the criteria that clients need to establish before eligible financings could be assessed. Where I think ADB is uniquely positioned, it's, with a very high, very positive credit rating, ADB could enter into that space and help clients' participation to achieve that. And I think that's probably what we're looking to leverage on with the policy update. With the policy update, there are clear challenges with the issuance of these bonds. There's limitation of information. A lot of the due diligence that are done is based upon information that is available. But if ADB, as a lender of choice with a very, very great credit rating, could leverage on this platform and make sure some of these principles, or some of them being voluntary at this stage, could compel clients to sign up to these frameworks or principles and make sure that they're actually done, verify and make sure that they're done. I think they represent significant milestone achievements. And that's, I think, what the policy in many instances would want to promote. I'm not sure whether maybe Bruce would want to touch a bit more on this space in terms of policy aspirations in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Felix. Thanks, Lawrence, and Petra for the questions on this one. I think our work in the sort of capital markets is still quite small and evolving. And as Lawrence has said, we have been applying the current safeguard policy statement to that work. But I think we have to look a little bit how that market is changing. Like so far, we've supported the issuance of corporate bonds, say, for renewable energy. Big Rim in Thailand, for example, was one example. And ADB supported them to issue a corporate bond for investment in renewable energy. But we went through a sort of quite detailed due diligence process on the actual assets that were going to be subject to the bond performance. So it's very much a even though a bond is part of the transaction, that was almost treated like a fairly standard environmental and social assessment process with an audit and corrective action plans. But if in the future we start to get into more broadly defined bonds, let's say if ADB was to support or take an equity holding in a company that was seeking to launch bonds for a wide and diverse portfolio. It would be a very different type of proposition. So I think we're still looking at that, and I think that's why I think also some, like the AIIB, are exploring, well, can you use ESG principles, which could be more broadly applied, and also looking at the unintended outcomes, and knowing that a standard environmental and social assessment process, a project-tailored process like you've got in performance standards, are not as well tailored for a less well-defined portfolio. So I think that's the sort of issue that we need to grapple with a little bit more. You might have some further views on that, Petra, because I think it's a space that we do really need to understand and explore a little bit more.
Thanks, Bruce, Felix, and Lawrence. That we had a team effort there. So hopefully, Petra got the full response that you needed there. So maybe, unless you've got any feedback, further questions on that, Petra. Okay, we got a thank you, helpful response. So I saw, Anne, you had got your hand up again. So perhaps I could turn to you next, Anne Pereiras from the NGO Forum. Anne, would you like to jump in?
Yes, thank you. So for my intervention, I have 3 set of comments and questions on FIs, second on ESMS, and the third is on ADB's organizational review. So for the first point on FIs, and this was also, I think some of you are also familiar with the Accelerating Infrastructure Investment Facility Fund in India. So it's an sovereign loan and categorized as an FI, and it is also in the nature of a multi-tranche financing facility. And as some of you are aware of, there were issues raised on labor rights violations, particularly on payment of wages to the workers in the sub-project on the Kiratpur 4-lane road project. So in terms of a specific question, coming into the new safeguards policy, will there be a specific policy provision to cover failure in instances of to pay for the payment to workers, as in the case of this particular project, when the company has gone into bankruptcy, or if there are any other unseen circumstances. As my other colleagues from BWI have also reiterated to ADB in terms of recommendation, we feel that there is a need for a specific policy or section on safeguards to ensure proper payment of wages to the workers that are being employed in any ADB funded project. And that includes in terms of specific nuance when we're talking about sub-project. So that's one. And then second, on the ESMS, I think in our experience, we'd like to reiterate again that is there a way in terms of how to reconcile when the bank or even the company is saying that confidentiality must be kept? In several instances when we ask for the ESMS, so again, this is not like there's no mandatory disclosure, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on that point, there's no mandatory disclosure for ESMS, so permission must be sought first to the company if they do allow for the ESMS to be disclosed. And if they are disclosed, there are also some information that are redacted, but from our end, we are particularly concerned in terms of basic project information. So we're not looking at like specific financial information, for instance. So in those kind of examples, is there a way in terms of how to reconcile the disclosure of ESMS in terms of monitoring its implementation as well? And then on the last point, on the ADB's organizational review, and we don't know if this might be premature to ask as of the moment, but we've taken note that in the organizational review, there are intent, of course, to expand the synergies between sovereign and non-sovereign operations, and empowering the one ADB project team approach. So how will this have an implication when you're talking about project implementation on the private sector, particularly the nuances if you're talking about those that are categorized as FIs? So that's all on my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it shows you're really on the ball with your knowledge on the reorg as well, which is a hot topic in ADB, I have to tell you, internally. So we've got three parts to this question, and maybe I'll turn to Bruce for the first one, and then Felix on ESMSs, and then maybe back to Bruce for the reorganization, if that works. So payments to workers, and you know, how are we making sure that in situations where things don't go right, that labour and so on is labour laws, etc., are still being looked after? So Bruce, maybe I can turn to you for that first one. Over to you.
Sure, thanks very much, Duncan, and thanks, Anne, for those questions. So on the first one, so the IIFCL project that you mentioned with a financial intermediary in India. So yeah, that one was certainly a pretty unfortunate situation where a contractor went bankrupt for financial reasons. And so it's not the actual financial intermediary itself, it's not the project itself, but it was a contractor. Now, wages themselves, the payment of wages, are not an area that's covered by the safeguards, but of course it's a requirement under national law to pay wages, you know, following national regulations around the level of wages. That's not something the safeguards gets into, but of course we require all of the projects to follow national requirements, and that would cover wages. And so, you know, wage payments is a non-negotiable issue. They need to be paid to people that are working on projects. But when there is an unfortunate situation of a bankruptcy, it then also follows the national legal requirements for insolvency. But in that particular project situation, it has led to some very unfortunate situations of workers who were not paid and were having to go through a court process to be able to access liquidated funding that was still available after the bankruptcy process, which is obviously complicated for affected people. Now, how can we address that in safeguards? This is not so much a financial intermediary issue, actually, but it's often an issue to do with contracts. And what we've seen in this review ourselves, and when we're looking at developing a new standard on labour and working conditions, is there are gaps in making sure that all employees and all contracted workers have the right contracts and conditions of employment. And this is pretty important in those types of situations, if there is claims of non-payment of wages, that contracts are in place and that those contracts have the right sorts of provisions. So I think that's an area that we can strengthen in terms of the safeguards. A little bit more challenging to deal with an unfortunate insolvency situation, but there are other things that you can do. I think this is one, and I'll take an opportunity to respond also to another comment that Sandesh had raised, which was about contractor performance bonds, and also the earlier question on insurance. So for contractors to have insurance or performance bonds, which can be a way to then address corrective actions, which could be around payment of wages, for example, indemnity insurance, other forms of insurance that can be put in place, or for the situation of where there's a non-compliance with a safeguard issue, where you can then go to a performance bond and have a contractor remediate that. So there are levers in the safeguards, and there's a number of these that we're looking to strengthen in the new policy framework. But they're not necessarily applicable just to financial intermediaries. It's a bigger issue for all types of projects to be able to work on those measures. So yeah, it's the first one. And if you have follow-up, always happy to pick that up with you. And I'll pass back to you, Duncan.
Oh, yes, there. Sorry. Okay, I will turn over to Felix in just a sec. I just wanted to say as well, you know, from a personal perspective, I've seen that in action, the performance bond used in another situation where a contractor went bankrupt in Armenia, and the performance bond was used to pay for the wages of the contractors, the actual staff, and also to remedy damage to property that had happened during the project, and that was used for that as well. So it is a very useful mechanism by which you can solve those issues that go on during project implementation. So Felix, we had a question from Anne relating to reconciling the information that is in ESMSs, how you know the confidentiality factor and the fact that sometimes the ESMSs are disclosed, maybe sometimes they're not, what is in, what isn't. So maybe you can provide some feedback on what our process is with ESMSs, because it's not necessarily a document, it's a system. So it's something that, you know, I think you need to unpack a little bit for Anne. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. And I saw Anne put a thumbs up with the earlier response. Just want to add one more liner that to address some of the contract issues and procurement issues, we've been working with our procurement department to strengthen our standard bidding documents, putting in some kind of EHS provisions within there to maybe screen some of these upstream and put in some corrective measures as part of the bidding process, so we don't maybe have those things tailing up. We're now assessing also contractors. So where there's been a legacy issue, maybe persistent legacy issue with a particular contractor, with workers in some areas, they now is a mandatory requirement for them to report. Although that does not disqualify them, it gives us the opportunity to proactively engage with them and put in mitigation measures so we don't have recurrence of that on new projects. Just to give, and I think going forward there will be a bit more stronger collaboration between the safeguards and the procurement and contract management arms of the bank's business to make sure where the opportunity avails is that we're able to mainstream some of these proactive mechanisms. Back to ESMS, yeah, and what can be disclosed and what cannot. I think, Duncan, you were spot on there. So I mentioned that ESMS as a safeguards instrument is a set of policy, procedures, and systems. And when you talk about corporate entity and including an FI, these can go into their bread and butter, detailing their main bank, their main core business that they do, because that is the businesses that those are the procedures that they follow. So do we disclose, does any MDB at all disclose the ESMS as it is? I can tell you no, because for the same reason, there may be some commercial confidential issue that may, you know, give a competitor to that institution an unfair advantage. So that cannot be done. But could we do more from what you're suggesting as a way of reconciling the whole safeguard framework and the need to disclose information? Can we do more as ADB? Yes, I think Bruce did mention that as part of the safeguard framework update, we're looking to reorg our own information database when you go. Our sister institutions like the IFC, EBRD, and even the African Development Bank, they do provide a summary of the ESMS. And that is a redacted version of the ESMS. It will tell you, for instance, whether the client has an ESMS or not, or which of the maybe 8 or 10 components of the ESMS that the client has. Maybe just the client has got just a policy per se. And so there's a need to develop procedures for screening, categorizing, assessing, management planning, consulting, disclosing information, monitoring, and reporting. All those elements which will form the key components of the ESMS, the client is yet to develop. It will highlight that. And then it will tell you what kind of corrective actions have been agreed. And most of these institutions will use an ESAP, Environmental Social Action Planning, in many instances, if you go to the IFC or EBR, the web pages, we tell you if the preparation of those elements of the ESMS are linked to disbursements in many instances and are subject for reporting and monitoring. So could we do more? Yes. At the moment, if you go to our ADB and you look at our project data sheets, you will see we disclose the categories of the FIs. That's where we got the information for me to plot the graphs and present. But there is more to reorganize those pages and provide a bit more. It's also, we could also improve by the audits that we do, the environmental and social audit from which we get information. That's part of our due diligence. Those also could be redacted. As far as those 3 conditions that I mentioned, where a particular jurisdiction has not got a policy restricting the disclosure, because ADB will not want to do anything against a particular country's policy or legislative requirement. And then it's not sensitive to the market, because sometimes during project processing, and let me make this also very clear, we talk about the bond market, the capital market, and how values of shares of corporate entities can change. If you unnecessarily disclose a corporate entity information, I'll give a classic example. ADB is, again, is a lender of choice. By people knowing that a particular corporate entity is ADB is looking to finance in that, it gives a lot of confidence that may increase share values. Moment they know the deal doesn't go through for one reason or the other, by which time we would have disclosed everything about the company, the share values can be going down the following day. So there's a bit of sensitivity with the market that we need to be also very cautious of, beyond that confidential information of the corporate entity that I mentioned. Hopefully that throws a little bit into the harmonization of the ESMS and what to disclose and what not to disclose.
Thank you very much, Felix. So we're kind of pretty much up against finishing off on time now. So what I'm going to suggest is, Anne, you had one final part to your question, which was to do with the reorganization of the bank, and what's the implications for the particularly with relation to the non-sovereign work and how that will fit in with the sovereign there. There's also been a question in the chat to do with labour in respect to bidding documents and how that could be improved from Shagufta Riaz. So Bruce, perhaps I can turn it to you to sort of try and put those things together in one final response, and then we can wrap up after that, if that's okay. Bruce, over to you.
Yeah, that sounds good, Duncan. Thank you. I'll just note in the chat, Petra, if you're still on the line, I put a little bit more information about some of the bonds and a project example in there as well. And coming to your point on the organizational review, so still fairly early days on that. We've got a kind of framework for what we're working on, and I can give you a quick summary of a few things that'll be important there. One, we'll be establishing a new office of safeguards, which will be a larger office, actually integrating more consistently all of what we call our safeguard family, the family of environmental and social experts that work in our safeguards. We've got 140 positions at the moment, but we'll be increasing that over this year up to almost 180, and then over the 2 years after that, we'll be putting in additional positions as well. So we're looking at how to deploy those people and resources more effectively. This will link over to the new policy, actually. So under the new environmental and social policy and the policy standards, we're really looking to try and increase the risk assessment process. We want to strengthen that. And we want to build into that also a contextual risk analysis. So it's about, the nature of the project, where it's located, the type of impacts that it's going to cause, the people that might be sensitive. So all of those sorts of things we look at already, but we're going to be looking in more depth across all of the individual standards. We'll also be looking at an integrated assessment. So we look at the relationships between environmental and social issues. And then we'll bring in this contextual risk analysis. And that's where you can also look at things like the capacity of your borrower or client. And this sort of links over also to Shagufta, your comment about, I think capacity. So you can bring these factors together. Why I'm raising that is under the new model, we'll be using that process to allocate resources more effectively to projects and project teams, trying to crowd in the right sort of expertise to the more complex projects, and then also focusing more on not just the preparation, but also the monitoring and supervision support to our clients. So they're the sorts of things that we're looking at the moment. There will also be more integration between the private sector operations and our sovereign operations with our developing member countries. We'll also be coming under one office for safeguards, both private sector and the sovereign operations. So a lot more opportunities for synergies with that, but still is very much a work in progress. Okay, and then Shagufta, your comment, and thanks for joining from BWI. So I was kind of touching on that there, that we are going to be looking more closely at the capacity of the borrower or the client when we make decisions. But your questions are also related to procurement. You're talking about the bidding process. And, procurement is not the safeguards. We have a separate procurement policy and procurement guidelines that follow that. And we have templates for procurement. We follow the FIDIC procurement templates and guidelines for that. But there are some things that we're seeking to strengthen, and this is also another work in progress. We want to make sure that in the bidding process, there's more detailed assessment of the capacity of the bidders to implement the environmental and social safeguards. And that would depend on what the project is, of course. What's their track record, what's their capacity. That's something that is being reviewed now, but we think it needs a closer look. And then there's other provisions. For example, I mentioned looking at what can you do if there's contractor non-compliance. That's another aspect. So these are areas that we're starting to work on with the procurement process within ADB as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. That was nicely wrapped up. So that brings us to the end of the session. Over to you, Gelson. Thanks, everybody, for your participation.
Thank you again, Duncan, for your smooth moderation. And again, huge appreciation from our participants for your very well thought out comments, which shows the depth and the breadth of your engagement on the topic. We know there's more to unpack and discuss, especially on clarifying the safeguards requirements and how they will apply to various financing modalities. So we expect more comments to come, including the written submissions. And again, these are being consolidated into our consultation summary notes, which will then feed into the drafting process of the W paper. But for now, please stay with us, because for the next 3 to 4 minutes, we will have a poll, which is now being flashed on your screen, which asks you to please rate your satisfaction with today's session. You can only select one number to represent your review of the way we run the consultation. We have also provided the link to Menti, which is asking for your feedback on how well we've done with this consultation and what else we can improve, which is going to be quite useful as we prepare for the next rounds of consultation, which is happening in phase 3 of this safeguards review process. Now, before I call on Bruce and before I flash the result, okay, we have the result now. I'm not sure if there are more people coming, but so far you have given us both 4 and 5 overall, which is a very, very good way to perhaps end our last final consultation, the 20th consultation, which is also I've been told that 86 consultation session for all these 20 thematic consultation. So what a way to conclude this consultation. And as you know, you have actually contributed to about 3,400 stakeholders that we have engaged since November of 2021. It's not just a number. It represents a lot of collective energy, shared direction, and of course, keeping yourselves engaged in many months of this consultation, which then speaks about your commitment and your interest to really be part of this very, very important policy revision process. So I now give the floor back to Bruce to provide a wrap of what we have heard from this session, at least, and then he will walk us through what to expect in the coming months as we wrap up the regional consultation part of the phase 2. Bruce?
Great, thanks very much, Gelson. And thanks so much to everyone for joining today. Really a lot of helpful points that you've raised, very interesting questions, sometimes very challenging issues that we still need to keep working through. But I really appreciate your time, not just for this consultation, but for the whole consultation program that we've done so far. And I know that many of you have actually dedicated a lot of your time and sometimes your evenings to spend with us. And this really is contributing in a very positive way to the whole process. I do want to thank you for today. I think we've had pretty interesting discussion and been able to touch on quite a number of the financing modalities that we do have at ADB. And you've given us some good suggestions on areas and issues to think about and improve. Policy-based lending, for example, in terms of, how do you really look at the whole program in an early stage and do the assessment processes and make sure that you can address any policy actions before you start to disperse funding for them. We've talked about the multi-tranche financing facility as a programmatic project financing modality, and again, sort of the need for a more upstream approach, looking at potential impacts of the program. Talked about technical assistance and some of the potential risks that may be in some technical assistance, such as when you've got policy support, consulting services going to policy support and the risks there. Emergency assistance loans, where you're trying to get money out the door quickly for quick emergency actions, but also balancing that with managing environmental and social risks that could occur through reconstruction. So, these are all pretty important issues. We've talked about capital market transactions, and then we've got into issues like insurance and performance bonds and labor issues, as well as capacity building. So, pretty wide breadth of topics, and all ones that we're going to be looking at in the next couple of weeks as we develop up this annex on financing mechanisms. So again, thank you so much for that. I'll just mention quickly on next steps. Gelson's already said a few words on this. So we're now wrapping up this, what we called phase 2. We had the analytical studies, consultations on the analytical studies, plus we did country consultations and consultations with affected people. That's channeling into the preparation of the draft. Although we're wrapping this phase up, and we're happy to be wrapping this bit up, there will be another phase though, which is after we release the draft policy, then we'll do further consultations later in the year on that. So do stay tuned. But at this point, in addition to thanking you that have joined us, I do want to thank our team. Gelson mentioned 84 consultations just for this regional program, but we've had actually more than 100 in total. We've done a lot of other different types of events, and we've had a great support from our team. We have a stakeholder engagement team that works very actively behind the scenes to do this. We have ADB's corporate services team that runs the whole web interface with Zoom and other tools. My team working on the environmental and social standards, and a lot of support from other teams across ADB, like our private sector operations. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much to our team. And, you know, we've all been learning a lot, and we'll keep doing that as we work through this process. So again, thanks so much to everyone, and we look forward to catching up with you in the future. Take care.